The vote came without warning. Not a formal notice. Not a diplomatic channel request. Not even a politely worded message from the council secretariat. Just a blinking amber light on my console and a flat automated voice informing me that a full session had been called and that my attendance was required within 20 minutes. I, Commander Ilara Voss, sole human delegate aboard the Galactic Council station, had been eating a cold sandwich at my desk when that light started blinking. I left the sandwich. I went. The council chamber was a wide, circular room with a vaulted ceiling that glowed soft blue. 44 delegate pods arranged in a sweeping arc, each one shaped and pressurized for a different species. Mine was the smallest one in the room. It always had been. I had long stopped being offended by that. Councillor Vreth of the Keth Dominion was already standing at the central podium when I arrived. He was a tall, gray-skinned being with 4 arms and the kind of composed expression that powerful people wore when they had already decided the outcome of something and were simply waiting for the ceremony to finish. He did not look at me when I entered. That told me everything. I sat down. I pulled up my console. I started reading. The document was called the Abandoned Human Act. It was 47 pages long, written in Galactic Standard, and it had been drafted, reviewed, amended, and co-signed by 31 of the 44 council members. I scrolled fast. I had always been a fast reader. By the time Vreth called the session to order, I had read enough. Humanity was being removed from the Council's protected species register. Our trade corridor access was being revoked. Every defensive treaty we held with Council member species was declared void. The Sol system, meaning Earth, was being reclassified as an open reclamation zone, which in plain language meant that any Council-recognized species could now legally move in and claim whatever they wanted. The stated reason, printed in careful, neutral language across page 3, was that humanity represented a net negative coefficient in the galactic ledger. Too small to contribute meaningfully. Too young as a spacefaring species to be stable partners. Too unpredictable. Too prone to conflict. Too expensive to protect. We were being cut loose. Vreth cleared his throat and addressed the chamber. He spoke in that slow, measured tone that powerful people use when they want to sound reasonable while doing something unreasonable. He said that the act had been under review for 2 years. He said it was a matter of resource optimization. He said that the Council had a responsibility to its functioning members, and that maintaining the infrastructure necessary to integrate humanity had become a burden that no longer served the collective good. He said all of this without once looking at my pod. Around the chamber, delegates sat quietly. Some watched Vreth. Some watched their consoles. The delegate from Cirrus 4, a tall insectoid being called Councillor Leth, was writing something on a data pad. The delegate from the Phelan Republic, a round, copper-colored being called Councillor Mira, had her eyes closed. She was not sleeping. She was simply not watching. When Vreth finished, he asked if any delegate wished to speak before the vote. I raised my hand. Vreth looked at me for the first time since I had entered the room. He paused for just a fraction of a second too long before nodding. I stood up. I did not take notes. I did not clear my throat. I looked around the chamber slowly, making eye contact with every delegate who was willing to hold it. I said only this: we have been part of this council for 62 years. In that time, we have responded to 14 humanitarian crises without being asked. We have maintained the supply corridors through Sector 7 through 11 at our own cost. We have mediated 9 border disputes between council members who could not agree on a table shape, let alone a treaty. We have done all of this while being told, repeatedly, that we were the smallest voice in the room. I paused. You are not cutting us loose, I said. You are removing a weight you never actually had to carry. You will notice the difference when it is gone. I sat back down. Vreth called the vote. 31 in favor. 12 abstentions. 1 against. The 1 against was mine. The act passed. The chamber made a soft procedural chime. Several delegates began gathering their things. Councillor Leth went back to his data pad. Councillor Mira finally opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. Vreth turned to me from the podium. He said, in a tone that was clearly meant to be kind, that this was not personal. That Earth would be given a standard transition period of 90 days before the reclamation designation became active. That humanity was welcome to petition for a re-evaluation in 50 years, once we had matured as a species. 50 years. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked around the room one more time. At the delegates who had not spoken. At the ones who had not even looked up. At the species that had eaten at our table and used our corridors and called on our mediation teams and signed our treaties. I picked up my console. I opened a channel to Earth. I did not encrypt it. I did not lower my voice. I said, clearly and calmly, so the entire chamber could hear, they cut us loose. Start the clock. Then I closed the channel, walked out of the chamber, and went back to my desk. The sandwich was still there. I finished it. Vreth sent me a message 40 minutes later. It said that my parting words had been, quote, unnecessarily dramatic, and that he hoped I would encourage Earth to cooperate with the transition process. I did not reply. I was already busy. The records office for the council station was 3 levels below the chamber. It was staffed by a single archivist, a quiet being called Counselor Vel, who was technically retired and technically not supposed to give me access to cross-species logistics data. Vel and I had eaten lunch together twice a week for 11 years. Vel handed me the access codes without being asked. I sat in that small room with 47 years of galactic trade data and started reading. Most humans, when threatened, make noise. They shout. They protest. They send strongly worded messages and hold emergency briefings and express outrage on every available channel. I had learned a long time ago that noise was what people made when they had no other options. I had other options. I read until the lights on the station cycled to their overnight setting. Then I kept reading. Because I had just been handed the most comprehensive map of what humanity was worth that had ever been assembled. And it was far bigger than the council knew. They had spent 2 years building a case that we were a burden. They had not spent a single hour calculating what it would cost them when we were gone. That was their mistake. And I intended to make sure they felt every single consequence of it. Start the clock, I had said. The clock had already started before I walked out of that chamber. It had started 40 years ago, when the first human engineer looked at the galactic infrastructure we were being slowly admitted into and quietly began preparing for the day we might be pushed out of it. We had never stopped preparing. Vreth thought he had ended something. He had only started a countdown. I poured a glass of water, set it beside the console, and kept working. Outside the station windows, the stars were the same as they had always been. Cold and distant and completely indifferent to the decisions made in small circular rooms by beings who believed that power was something you held, rather than something you built. I had never believed that. Not once. Not ever. And in approximately 18 hours, the Galactic Council was going to begin learning why. The first fleet came in 18 hours and 43 minutes. Not the Council's fleet. They did not send a fleet. They sent a legal notice and waited to see who moved first. The Yeth Consortium moved first. I was still in the records office when the proximity alert reached me through the station's public broadcast system. A calm synthetic voice announced that an unscheduled fleet had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the outer boundary of the Sol system, approximately 200 million kilometers past the Oort cloud. 11 ships. 3 heavy haulers, 2 escort frigates, and 6 vessels classified as resource extraction platforms. They had not even waited for the 90-day transition period. The ink on the act was still processing through the legal registry. I noted the time, noted the fleet composition, and opened a channel to Earth. Admiral Claude Harris answered on the second tone. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and a habit of speaking very slowly when things were very serious. He was speaking slowly now. He said, "We see them." I said, "Patch me through to their lead ship. I want to hear how they open." Harris patched me through. There was a brief static hiss, and then a voice came through, speaking in galactic standard with the clipped, commercial precision of a trade captain who was confident in his legal standing. The voice identified itself as Captain Dreth of the Yeth Consortium Vessel Recovery 1. It said that the Yeth Consortium was exercising its legal right under the recently passed Abandoned Human Act to initiate a resource survey of the Sol system, beginning with the outer asteroid belt. It said that it expected Earth's government to acknowledge the legal validity of this action and to avoid interference. It then asked if there was anyone from Earth's administration available to confirm receipt of this declaration. Harris looked at me through the screen. I could see the muscle in his jaw working. I said, "Yes, Admiral. I think you should answer them." Harris turned back to his channel and said, very calmly, that he was Admiral Claude Harris of Earth's Unified Defense Command and that Earth acknowledged receipt of the declaration. He said that in the interest of clarity, he wanted to offer the Consortium one opportunity to stand down and return to their origin point before Earth's response was initiated. There was a pause on the Consortium's end. Then the captain said, with a tone that carried both amusement and impatience, that Earth had no legal treaty authority remaining and that any defensive action Earth took would be recorded as an act of aggression against a Council-recognized commercial entity. Harris said, "I understand." Then he closed the channel and looked at me. I said, "Proceed, Admiral. Remember what we discussed?" Harris nodded once. He turned to his operations team and gave the order. What happened next was not what the YETH Consortium expected. It was not what the Galactic Council expected either, because 6 of the Council's senior delegates were watching the situation through the station's long-range sensors when it happened, and I know this because Counselor Mira sent me a very short message 40 minutes later that said simply, "How?" The question was fair. Earth's defense grid had never been classified as a serious military threat. It was too spread out, too varied in design, and too obviously assembled from 100 different projects over 40 years to look like a coherent weapon system. The Council's military analysts had reviewed it twice and concluded that while Earth could probably defend its immediate orbital space, anything beyond the Moon's orbit was effectively undefended. That assessment had been accurate at the time it was written. It had simply not been updated in 11 years. When Harris gave his order, Earth did not fire a single projectile. Instead, 47 independently operated platforms, distributed across a volume of space roughly the size of a small nation, simultaneously activated a layered electromagnetic pulse architecture that had taken 14 years to design and position. It did not explode. It did not destroy. It was, at its core, an extraordinarily precise disruption system, developed by a team of engineers who had spent a decade studying exactly how Galactic Standard ship systems responded to specific frequency combinations. Every ship in the YETH fleet went dark within 4 minutes. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Simply stopped. Every drive, every weapon, every propulsion system, every communication array, every navigation computer. Offline. The ships were whole and intact. The crews were unharmed. They were simply, completely, unable to do anything at all. The heavy haulers drifted in a loose formation. The extraction platforms spun slowly on their axes. The escort frigates, whose pilots had clearly tried to perform emergency maneuvers, had turned sideways and stopped. It looked, from a distance, like someone had pressed pause on a very expensive piece of machinery. Harris gave the second order. 3 human rescue vessels, already positioned and waiting, moved out to meet the drifting fleet and establish towing connections. Within 90 minutes, all 11 YETH ships were being gently guided toward a stable orbital position above Earth's equator. The crews were given food, water, access to communication systems to contact their families, and a written explanation in Galactic Standard that they were guests of Earth's government and would be treated accordingly, and that their ships would be returned to them in full working order once the YETH Consortium confirmed that it was withdrawing its claim under the Abandoned Human Act. Not a single crew member was harmed. Not a single ship was damaged. Every piece of equipment was intact. Harris sent a brief transmission to the YETH Consortium's home office that said, "Your fleet is safe. Your crews are comfortable. We do not waste resources. Please advise on how you wish to proceed." The response from the YETH Consortium's legal department arrived in less than 3 hours. It was a full withdrawal of the reclamation claim, an acknowledgement that the approach had been premature, and a request for the earliest possible date for the return of their vessels. Harris forwarded it to me without comment. I was not looking at the YETH response when it arrived. I was looking at something far more interesting. I had spent the night in the records office going through 47 years of galactic logistics data. And what I had found was not a picture of human weakness. It was a picture of something the Council had never bothered to look at closely because it had never caused them any trouble. Quiet dependency. It was not the dramatic kind. Humans had never controlled a region of space. We had never had the largest ships or the strongest weapons or the most territory. What we had, slowly and steadily over 6 decades, was become the single most common point of contact in the galaxy's practical, day-to-day functioning. Our engineering teams maintained the drive systems on 61% of all mid-tier vessels registered with the Council. Not because we were the only ones who could. Because we were reliable, affordable, and available on short notice. Because human engineers showed up when others did not. Because a human logistics hub would accept an emergency cargo reroute at 3 in the morning when no one else would answer the channel. Our medical research teams had developed or contributed to treatments for diseases affecting 29 different species. Not because we were the most advanced. Because we were curious about everything and unwilling to let a problem sit unsolved. Our trade corridor maintenance contracts, which we had always undercharged for because we valued the relationship more than the margin, kept functional 83% of the safe transit lanes in sectors 7 through 14. We were not the biggest thing in the galaxy. We were the thing the biggest things quietly depended on. And now that I had the full picture, I could see something else clearly. The Council had not passed the Abandoned Human Act because they had carefully calculated our value and determined we were worth less than we cost. They had passed it because we had never made them feel how much they needed us. We had been too good at making everything look easy. That was about to change. Within hours of the Yeth incident reaching the broader Galactic news feeds, my communication console began receiving messages. Not from the great powers. From the small ones. 17 species, ranging from the trade collective of Dunvar to the independent settlements of the Hask cluster, contacted me within a 48-hour window. Some sent formal diplomatic notes. Some sent private messages from their senior officials. 2 of them sent just a single line, "What do we do now?" They were all asking the same question, even if they phrased it differently. If Earth could be reclassified as an open zone, so could they. The Council had thought it was removing one inconvenient species from its ledger. It had not accounted for what the example would signal to every other small, young, or politically inconvenient species watching from the edges of the chamber. It had opened a door. I intended to walk every one of those 17 species through it with me. I sent a message to each of them. Same message, slightly adjusted for each species' diplomatic preferences. It said, "You are not abandoned. Come talk to me." Harris sent a follow-up message while I was writing those replies. It said simply, "Nice work. What next?" I replied, "Now we show them what we built while they weren't paying attention." I looked at the sensor feed. The Yeth fleet was still in Earth's orbit, waiting. Neat and intact and harmless, and a very clear demonstration to anyone who cared to look that humanity did not need to destroy things to make a point. We just needed to stop them. Gently. Thoroughly. And with full documentation. Vreth had not yet responded to any of my messages. He would. They always did, eventually, when the quiet started to cost them something. I poured another glass of water and got back to work. The Coalition of the Abandoned did not have a dramatic founding. There was no ceremony, no signing table, no formal declaration broadcast across every channel in the galaxy. It started, practically, with 17 separate video calls across 3 days, most of which I conducted while eating, because there was no time to stop eating and also conduct diplomacy. The beings I spoke with were not, for the most part, the powerful leaders their titles suggested. They were worried administrators. Cautious traders. Species that had spent years carefully building relationships with the Council's framework only to watch, in real time, as that framework demonstrated it could simply decide you were no longer worth the paperwork. They came to me not because humanity was powerful. They came because humanity had just shown the galaxy that being small did not mean being helpless. The first call was with Director Olin of the Dunvar Trade Collective. Olin was a compact, gray-furred being with quick eyes and a habit of tapping one finger against the edge of his desk when he was calculating something. He tapped throughout our entire first conversation. He said, "We have watched what happened at your system. We understand what it means." I said, "What does it mean to you?" He said, "It means the Council passes laws without measuring consequences. It means those of us outside the inner circle are options, not obligations. It means we have been operating under the assumption that the rules protect everyone. That assumption is no longer reliable." I said, Correct. So what do you want to do about it? He tapped his finger 3 more times. Then he said, "What are you building?" I said, "Something that makes the council's math stop working in their favor." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "We are interested." The second call was harder. The Hask cluster settlements were represented by a young administrator named Lena Ford, a human woman who had been born in the cluster to parents who had emigrated from Earth decades earlier. She had never set foot on Earth. She had grown up entirely within the council's framework. She was, in her own words, terrified. She said, "I read the act. I read the whole thing. It says Earth. But the language in Section 12, the part about unstable species with insufficient strategic value, that language could apply to us. We are human. Technically." I said, "Yes. Technically." She said, "Does that mean we are next?" I said, "Not if we move correctly." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means we stop asking the council to protect us and start building something that makes protecting us the obviously rational choice." Ford sat back in her chair. She looked young and exhausted and more clear-eyed than most people twice her age. She said, "That sounds like a threat." I said, "It is not a threat. It is an offer. There is a difference. A threat says do what I want or I will harm you. An offer says here is something that benefits both of us, and here is why not taking it will cost you." She thought about it. Then she said, "I am in." I moved through the list. Call by call. Species by species. The Dunbar Collective, the Hask settlements, the Orith manufacturing guilds, the Pelin research communities, the Vesk Agricultural Union. Small. Careful. Quiet. All of them sharing the same underlying fear and the same underlying question. By the end of day 3, I had 17 confirmed participants. By the end of day 4, I had 21. I called them the Infrastructure Coalition. Not a military alliance. The word military would have sent half of them out of the room immediately, and honestly it was the wrong frame. We were not building an army. We were building a network. The genius of it, if I am allowed to call it that, was not my idea. It was the product of 40 years of human economic thinking by people who had seen this possibility coming long before I was in this chair. Here was the reality that my night in the records office had shown me clearly. The Galactic Council ran on a framework of large, impressive, well-documented systems. Great shipyards. Enormous starbases. Massive political institutions with centuries of tradition. But those systems ran on 1,000 smaller ones that no one wrote reports about. The repair depots. The independent logistics hubs. The freelance medical researchers. The corridor maintenance contractors. The small batch pharmaceutical suppliers. The emergency response networks that could reach a crisis point in 48 hours because they had regional staging areas no one had formally registered with the Council's infrastructure office. 61% of those smaller systems were operated by humans or by species with deep human operational partnerships. And the other 39% were almost entirely operated by the 21 species now sitting in my coalition. The Council had built a beautiful, expensive, impressive structure. And they had quietly hired out the foundations to us. I called a full coalition meeting on the morning of the 4th day. All 21 parties present. I put the infrastructure dependency map on the shared screen. It took me about 90 seconds to walk them through it. The room, so to speak, went very quiet. Director Olin's finger had stopped tapping. Lena Ford was leaning forward with both hands flat on her desk. The Orith Guild representative, a tall crystalline being called Administrator Rel, had all 4 of its visual receptors focused on the screen in a way that suggested genuine surprise. I said, "This is not a map of power. Power is what the Council has. This is a map of function. Of what actually keeps things running, day to day, ship to ship, station to station. And it turns out that function runs through us." I let them look at it for a moment longer. Then I said, "The Council voted to abandon us because they did not see us clearly. They looked at the chamber and counted who had the largest ships and the most territory. They did not look at the corridor maintenance logs. They did not read the emergency response deployment records. They did not calculate what happens to 61% of mid-tier vessel operations when the contracts that support them are voided. I said, we are going to show them. I was not proposing sabotage. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because it matters enormously. I was not proposing that we cut services, or pull contracts, or leave ships stranded, or stop responding to emergencies. Harming innocent people, harming crews who had nothing to do with the council vote, was not something I was willing to do. It was not something any member of the coalition was willing to do either. What I was proposing was documentation. I wanted every coalition member to prepare a detailed, precise, fully verified account of every service, contract, maintenance agreement, emergency response deployment, and logistical arrangement they provided to council member species. Not future projections. Real numbers. Real histories. Real records. And then I wanted to present those records to the council with a single question: what does this cost to replace? Director Olin understood immediately. He said, you are going to make them calculate what they are actually spending. I said, I am going to make them calculate what they would have to spend. Lena Ford said, and if they cannot replace it? I said, then they will know, officially and on the record, that the Abandoned Human Act has a price tag. And they will have to decide whether they want to pay it or reverse it. The coalition spent the next 48 hours pulling records. 21 species, hundreds of representatives, going through decades of operational data and assembling it into a single document. It was the most thorough accounting of practical galactic infrastructure ever compiled, and it was compiled in 2 days because everyone in the coalition was highly motivated. The final document was 912 pages long. It covered services rendered, emergencies responded to, systems maintained, and crises prevented, across 84 different council-recognized species and 417 separate operational systems. At the bottom of page 1, I had added a single line. It said, approximate replacement cost at current council contractor rates, 417 trillion standard credits per galactic year. I sent it to Vreth with a cover letter that was 3 sentences long. It said, I hope this provides useful context for the council's resource optimization calculations. We remain committed to the welfare of all species. We look forward to your response. Vreth read it. I know he read it because his red receipt came back in under 8 minutes. He did not respond immediately. That was fine. I did not need him to. Because the document had also been sent, simultaneously, to the public press office of every council member species and every coalition partner. It was on the galactic news feeds within the hour. The response was immediate and noisy and deeply satisfying to read. Not from the great powers. They were still processing. The noise was from the middle tier. From species whose logistics officers and fleet maintenance commanders and medical supply directors were reading the document and doing their own math and then, very urgently, calling their political offices to explain what they had just found. Counselor Mira sent me a message that said, "You have made the chamber very uncomfortable." I replied, I intend to make it more uncomfortable. For a while. And then much more comfortable than it has ever been. She did not reply to that. But she did not need to. Vreth had been wrong about one thing in his speech to the chamber. He had said that maintaining humanity had become a burden the council could not justify. The document had just shown, in 912 pages of verified records, that the burden had always run the other direction. We were not the ones being carried. We were the ones doing the carrying. And now everyone knew it. The collapse did not happen all at once. It came in pieces, like a wall that has been cracking quietly for years finally deciding to fall on a Tuesday. The first piece fell on the morning of day 6. Counselor Vreth was in the middle of a press conference. He was doing what powerful people do when confronted with uncomfortable information. He was explaining it away. He was standing at a podium in the council's public affairs chamber, with a carefully composed expression and a team of advisors just off screen, saying that the infrastructure document released by the so-called coalition was an exaggeration. That it had been assembled selectively. That the council had thoroughly evaluated all dependencies prior to the vote and had determined that no significant disruption would result from the act's passage. He was explaining this very calmly when his communications director walked onto the stage and handed him a tablet. The press conference stopped. Vreth looked at the tablet. He read it twice. His composure did not break, but it bent. visibly. Even through a screen, you could see the exact moment he realized that something had changed. He excused himself from the podium and did not return. What was on that tablet was a message from the Keth Dominion's Fleet Operations Division. It said that 3 of their long-range patrol vessels had developed critical drive failures in Sector 9 and were requesting emergency maintenance support. Under standard protocol, the nearest qualified repair depot was a human-operated facility called Hendricks Station, named after the engineer who had built it 31 years ago. That facility had, upon receiving the Council's official notification that human trade corridor access was revoked, updated its service terms in accordance with the new legal framework. It would still serve anyone. But Council-contracted vessels without an active human bilateral agreement would now be charged at standard commercial rates rather than treaty-subsidized rates. The standard commercial rate for emergency drive repair on a Keth long-range patrol vessel was approximately 400,000 credits per ship. 3 ships. 1.2 million credits. Not ruinous. But also not in the budget that the Keth Dominion's Fleet Command had approved for the quarter. And not something they could simply reroute, because Hendricks Station was the only facility within range with the specialized equipment required for Keth drive architecture, which had been designed partly in consultation with human engineers who had since updated their licensing terms to align with the new legal framework. The Keth Dominion's Fleet Operations Division wanted to know who was authorizing the expenditure. Vreth had not authorized it. It had not been in any of the Council's projections. The projections had assumed that service providers would continue operating under the old terms regardless of the Act, because the Act only changed Earth's legal status, not the status of independent contractors. Those independent contractors disagreed. They were not cutting service. They were simply charging market rate. And the market rate, without the treaty framework that humanity had negotiated over 60 years, was considerably higher than anyone had been paying. That was Piece 1. Piece 2 came on Day 7. A border incident in what had been human-mediated space between the Keth Dominion and the Phelan Republic. A disputed transit lane in Sector 10, where a Keth commercial convoy and a Phelan patrol had both attempted to occupy the same corridor simultaneously. Under the old framework, human mediators had maintained the agreed protocols for exactly this kind of overlap. Every ship captain in that sector had a human-authored navigation agreement on their system that told them precisely who had right-of-way and when. Without an active human administrative presence in the sector, the navigation agreements had no enforcement mechanism. Both captains believed they were in the right. Both captains refused to yield. The situation had escalated to the point where shots were fired. Not lethal, fortunately. Warning shots. But warning shots in a contested corridor with 2 species who had a long history of border disagreements was the kind of thing that turned into something much worse if no one stepped in quickly. The Council's Emergency Response Office contacted Human Diplomatic Corps on instinct. Then, 3 seconds later, remembered that Human Diplomatic Corps no longer had authorized operational status in Council space. The Response Office had then contacted the Keth Dominion's diplomatic team, who contacted the Phelan Republic's diplomatic team, who contacted the Council's legal office to ask whether the old mediation protocols still applied. The legal office said it was reviewing the question. The review would take 72 hours. In the meantime, 2 irritated ship captains were sitting at opposite ends of a transit corridor making increasingly impatient transmissions. I was watching this happen through the Coalition's monitoring channels. Lena Ford messaged me and asked if we should intervene. I said not yet. Let them ask. Ford said, what if it gets worse before they ask? I said, then we respond because it is the right thing to do. Not because we are performing. And we document that we responded. Ford said, and if no one asks at all? I said, they will ask. She said, how can you be certain? I said, because Vreth just lost 1.2 million credits on 3 ships he could not get serviced, and there is a border incident in Sector 10 that his diplomats cannot resolve without the people he just voted to abandon. And the Galactic Stock Exchange has dropped 9% in 6 days because every logistics analyst in the galaxy just read a 900-page document and did math that the Council apparently did not do before the vote. Ford was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you have been waiting for this. I said, I have been preparing for this. There is a difference. The border incident in Sector 10 resolved itself after 11 hours when a retired human navigation specialist named Peter Lane, who had been living on a station in Sector 9 for 20 years, simply called both captains on his private channel and talked them through a compromise docking rotation. Lane had no official status. He was not acting on behalf of anyone. He just knew both protocols and both captains and thought the situation was unnecessary. He did not tell anyone he had done it. He went back to his dinner. I heard about it through the coalition monitoring system. I made a note in the documentation file. Piece 3 came on day 9. The Sirius 4 outbreak. Sirius 4 was a temperate world with a population of about 400 million, predominantly a species called the Sirite, who were a gentle, intellectual people with a strong tradition of architecture and very little experience with infectious disease. They had largely been protected from epidemic events by the Council's standard quarantine protocols, which were in turn monitored and supported by a joint health response network that included, as its single largest contributor, Earth's Interplanetary Disease Control Division. Earth's Interplanetary Disease Control Division had, as of the Act's passage, no legal operating authority in Council space. The pathogen that appeared on Sirius 4 on day 9 was not new. It had been catalogued. Earth's division had developed a containment protocol for it 17 years earlier following an outbreak on a different world. The protocol was not complicated. It required specific equipment, specific personnel, and the willingness to enter a high-risk environment quickly and without extended preparation time. The Council's response office had 3 other organizations on its emergency health response list. 2 of them contacted back within 4 hours to say they did not have personnel trained in the specific containment protocol. One of them said their nearest team was 14 days away. By the time the Council's response office had processed all of this, 412 Sirites had been confirmed infected and the number was rising. Councillor Leth, who represented a species closely related to the Sirite and who had been one of the 31 who voted for the Act, called me directly. He did not begin with pleasantries. He said, "You know about Sirius 4?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You know we need the division's containment team." I said, "Yes." He said, "The Act prevents us from formally requesting it through the Council framework." I said, "Yes." There was a pause. Leth was not, by nature, a humble being. He had centuries of institutional history and diplomatic tradition behind him that made humility feel like an unusual posture. I could hear him finding it. He said, "Is there another channel?" I said, "There is a volunteer team. 12 people. Already staged and ready. They can be on Sirius 4 in 31 hours. Leth said, "Staged? You staged them before I called." I said, "I staged them the day the Act passed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" I said, "Because 400 million people live on Sirius 4. And they had nothing to do with the vote." Leth processed this. Then he said, "What do you want in return?" I said, "Nothing. Go authorize the landing clearance. We will handle the rest." The team landed on Sirius 4 30 hours and 14 minutes later. They were 12 volunteers with full containment gear, the correct pharmaceutical compounds, and a 20-year-old protocol that worked exactly as designed. The outbreak was contained in 11 days. The final infected count was 6,308. Deaths, 0. Earth asked for nothing in return. The team returned to their staging station, filed their reports, and went home. The Galactic news feeds ran the story for 3 straight days. Vreth sent me no messages during this period. He was, according to the Council station's internal communications logs that Councillor Vell continued to quietly share with me, in an extended series of closed meetings with the Council's legal and economic advisory committees. I knew what they were calculating. I could have told them the answer, but it was better for them to arrive at it themselves. The Abandoned Human Act had passed because the Council believed that removing us would simplify their ledger. The ledger had not simplified. It had become a document full of costs that had not previously appeared because we had been absorbing them quietly, efficiently, without complaint, for 62 years. The point was not that humanity was indispensable. No single species is truly indispensable. The point was that the Council had made a decision without understanding the system they were operating within. They had thought they were cutting a line item from a budget. They had actually been cutting a structural support from a building that was now creaking in several places simultaneously. I spent the 3 weeks after Cirrus 4 working with the coalition on the full formal proposal. It was not a demand. I was careful about that. A demand creates resistance. A proposal creates a conversation. And what I wanted was a conversation, because conversations left room for the other person to convince themselves that the conclusion was their own idea. The proposal laid out 3 things. First, a restructured infrastructure partnership agreement between the coalition and the council, formally recognizing the operational role of coalition members in galactic logistics, medical response, and corridor maintenance. Not a favor. A contract. With rates, terms, and protections that reflected the actual market value of the services being provided. Second, a revision to the reclamation zone classification system, requiring that any designation of a species' home territory as open territory must first go through a full dependency impact review, to ensure that the Council understood what systems would be affected before it made any more decisions based on incomplete information. Third, permanent representation for coalition member species on the Council's infrastructure and logistics committees, with actual voting rights, not advisory status. It was not a small ask. I knew that. But I also knew that the Council had just spent 3 weeks watching what the world looked like without the things the coalition provided, and the view had not been comfortable. I sent the proposal to all 44 Council members simultaneously. Not just to Vreth. To all of them. Then I waited. Day 22. A message from Councillor Mira. It said, privately, and not for the record, I want to tell you that several members of the Chamber are taking this proposal seriously. Vreth is not the Council. There are other voices. I said, I know. I was counting on them. Mira said, you knew who would shift. I said, I knew which ones were practical. Practical people respond to practical documents. The proposal is a practical document. Mira said, and the ones who are not practical. I said, we'll do the math eventually. Day 24. Director Olin messaged the Coalition Group channel with a single line, the Orith Guilds just received a formal inquiry from a Keth Dominion logistics company asking whether we would be interested in a direct service partnership outside the Council framework. I replied, tell them we will consider it once the Council vote is complete. Olin replied, you are using us as leverage. I replied, I am using the situation as leverage. You are benefiting from it the same as I am. The difference is I was honest about that from the beginning. Olin sent a single character back. It was the Dunvar equivalent of a smile. Day 26. Lena Ford called me from the Hask cluster. She looked tired and energized at the same time, the particular look of someone who has been working very hard on something that matters. She said, I have been thinking about what you said. About the difference between a threat and an offer. I said, and? She said, I think the Council is learning that difference right now. I said, what makes you say that? She said, because Vretha's office just asked my administrator for a private meeting. I said, do not go to that meeting. Ford looked surprised. She said, why not? I said, because if Vreth wants to speak with you privately, before a formal response, it means he is trying to find a way to resolve this quietly, without going through the full proposal process. A quiet resolution protects him. A full proposal process protects you. Do not accept a quiet resolution. Ford thought about it. Then she said, you have done this before. I said, I have studied enough history to recognize the pattern. Ford said, how many times in history has a small species been in this position? I said, more than you would expect. Fewer than there should have been. She nodded. Then she said, all right. I will decline the private meeting. I said, send Vreth a polite message saying you are looking forward to the Council's formal response to the coalition proposal and that you hope to discuss it in the full session. Ford said, and that's it. I said, that is everything. The wall finished falling on day 29. Not with a dramatic crack. With a calendar notice. A formal session of the Galactic Council had been scheduled for day 31. The agenda item was listed simply as, Review of the Abandoned Human Act, Second Consideration. Second consideration. The most diplomatic language possible, for we made a mistake and now we have to fix it without saying those words out loud. I sat back in my chair in the small office I had borrowed on the station. Outside the window, the Sector 9 stars burned quietly. Somewhere out there, Hendrix Station was still charging market rates. The Haas cluster was still running. Sirius 4 was healthy. Peter Lane had probably made himself another dinner. Harris sent me a message. The Yeth Consortium sent a thank you note for the return of their ships. Apparently the catering during their stay on Earth was exceptional. I sent back, noted. Remind me to thank whoever ordered the food. I read the Coalition's message board for a while. 21 species, hundreds of representatives, all quietly excited and quietly anxious and all asking the same question in different ways. Do you think it will work? I did not answer that publicly. Instead I wrote a short message to the full group that said, show up to the session. Look calm. Do not negotiate in the hallways before the meeting. Everything happens in the room. Then I closed my console and went to sleep. For the first time in 30 days, I slept a full 8 hours. The session was called for the morning cycle, Galactic Station time. I arrived early. Not dramatically early. Just early enough to choose my seat and arrange my materials and be already settled and calm when the other delegates began filing in. This is a small thing, but it matters. Who is settled when others arrive communicates something. It says, I have been waiting. I am not rushed. I am comfortable here. Vreth arrived 12 minutes before the session opened. He glanced at me when he entered. I gave him a professional nod. He returned it. We had not spoken privately since the act had passed. I did not intend to change that before the session began. The chamber filled slowly. Some delegates carried the slightly heightened energy of people who had been debating something intensely for days and were arriving to the moment when debate had to become decision. Counselor Mira sat 2 pods away from me and did not speak, but when she sat down she gave me a small, deliberate nod that said more than most speeches. Counselor Leth arrived last. He was one of the 31 who had voted for the act. He sat down across the chamber from me and looked at the table. He did not look up. Vreth called the session to order. He did not begin with the proposal. He began with what I had expected, a brief, formal accounting of events since the act's passage. He described the Yeth incident as an unauthorized commercial action that had been resolved without significant incident. He described the border situation in Sector 10 as a routine navigation dispute. He described the Sirius 4 response as a voluntary humanitarian gesture by independent contractors with no formal standing. I let him describe all of it exactly as he wished to describe it. Then he said, the Council has received, from the Infrastructure Coalition, a proposal for a revised partnership framework. This proposal has been reviewed by the advisory committees and is before the session for formal consideration today. He looked around the room. He looked, briefly, at me. He said, the Council recognizes that the original assessment underlying the Abandoned Human Act may have been based on incomplete information. May have been. Incomplete. I appreciated the precision of that language. It was the most that a being like Vreth could offer in a public forum, and I had been prepared to accept it. I did not react. I continued looking at the table in front of me. Vreth said, the advisory committees have prepared an analysis of the coalition proposal. That analysis has been distributed to all delegates. The session is now open for comments and questions before we move to a formal vote. What followed was 90 minutes of discussion that I will not detail completely, but the broad shape of it was this: the delegates who had voted for the act divided into 2 groups. Those who were genuinely embarrassed and said very little, and those who tried to find technical arguments against specific elements of the proposal and were quietly demolished by the data that the coalition had assembled. Counselor Leth spoke once. He said, carefully and without looking at me, that the Sirius 4 situation had demonstrated clearly that the Council's health response infrastructure had a dependency that had not been adequately accounted for in the Act's impact review. He said that this was a systemic failure of the Council's analytical process and that the proposal offered a reasonable structural correction. Coming from one of the original 31, this landed heavily. The delegate from the Phelan Republic, a young official who had replaced Counselor Myra's predecessor only 6 months earlier, asked a good question. She asked whether the infrastructure partnership framework in the proposal would apply retroactively to services rendered since the Act's passage. I answered. I said that the coalition was not seeking retroactive compensation. We were seeking a foundation for a different kind of relationship going forward. A relationship built on documented value and mutual recognition rather than informal dependency and institutional invisibility. The delegate wrote something down. 2 other delegates asked technical questions about the reclamation zone review process. I had prepared answers to both. They were satisfied. Then Vreth asked if there were any remaining objections. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Not an empty quiet. A deliberate one, the kind where people are deciding whether they want to be the one who stands between the room and its conclusion. No one spoke. Vreth said, "The session will move to a formal vote on the Infrastructure Coalition's proposal." He did not add any editorial. He simply called the vote. I watched the board as the responses came in. One by one. 31, 32, 33. I counted without visibly counting. I had done the math already. I knew which delegates were certain, which were likely, which were possible. I had been preparing for this vote for 30 days. 44 yes votes. 0 abstentions. 0 against. It was unanimous. I looked at the board for a moment. Then I looked at my hands on the table. Then I looked up. Vreth announced the result in the standard formulaic language. The Infrastructure Coalition's proposal was accepted. The Abandoned Human Act was formally repealed. The revised partnership framework would be submitted to the legal registry for official encoding within 30 days. Coalition member species would receive their formal certification documents by the end of the station week. He said all of this in the flat, professional tone of a being performing a function. There was no moment of acknowledgement. No admission. No particular expression. I did not need one. After the session officially closed and delegates began leaving, I stayed in my seat. Director Olin sent me a message through the coalition channel that said simply, "Well done." Lena Ford sent one that said, "I cannot believe that actually worked." Harris sent one that said, "Drinks are on me. Next time you are on Earth." I replied to Ford, "It always had a chance of working. That is why we built it to work." I replied to Harris, "Hold me to that." Counselor Mira stopped beside my pod on her way out. She was one of the 12 who had abstained on the original vote. She stood for a moment, and then she said, quietly, "You never threatened anyone." I said, "No." She said, "I was watching for it. I expected it." The Yeth incident. The border situation. The Cirrus response. I kept waiting for the moment you turned it into leverage. I said, "It was leverage." The difference is leverage does not have to look like a weapon. Mira considered this. Then she said, "Where did you learn that?" I said, "From 62 years of being the smallest voice in the room. You learn to be precise when you cannot afford to be loud." She nodded. She left. I sat in the empty chamber for a few minutes longer. The blue ceiling glow cycled slowly, the way it did when sessions were over and the environmental systems were recalibrating. The pods were all empty. The screens were dark. The great circular room was just a room. I thought about the 47 years of logistics data I had read in the records office on that first night. All those charts, all those corridors, all those contracts. All that quiet, unrecorded labor. All those ships that got repaired and all those outbreaks that got contained and all those border disputes that got resolved before they became wars. None of it was in the Council's impact assessment. It was in the records, if you knew where to look. But no one had looked, because why would you look for something you had never been asked to account for? Humanity had spent 62 years being useful without making it visible. We had believed, somewhere in the back of our collective thinking, that doing good work was enough. That the work would speak for itself. The work did not speak for itself. The work had to be assembled into 912 pages and sent to every delegate simultaneously before anyone heard it. That was the lesson I was taking home. I picked up my console. I had 7 new messages. Coalition business, follow-up requests, a note from Vel in the records office that said, "I heard it went well. Lunch is on me when you have time." I started writing back to Vel when Vreth appeared in the doorway. He was alone. No advisors. No aides. Just him, standing in the entrance to the chamber, looking at me across the rows of empty pods with an expression that I had not seen on his face before. It was not an apology. I had not expected an apology. Vreth was the kind of being for whom apology was a private, internal transaction that he would conduct at some point when he was alone with the accounting of his own decisions. That was his process. I was not going to wait for it. But he said something. He said, "You were ready for this." I said, "Yes." He said, "Before the vote." I said, "Long before the vote." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We did not know that." I said, "I know." He said, "We should have known that." I said, "Yes." He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he said, "The act was passed on the conclusion that humanity was a net negative coefficient in the galactic ledger." I said, "I remember." He said, "The conclusion was wrong." I said, "It was based on incomplete data." He said, "Yes. It was based on incomplete data." He stood there for another second or two. Then he gave me a professional nod, very similar to the one I had given him when he had arrived that morning. And then he walked away. I watched him go. Then I turned back to my console and finished my message to Vel. That evening, sitting at my desk with a cup of tea and the quiet hum of the station around me, I opened my personal log. I had been keeping a personal log since my first day as Earth's delegate, 11 years earlier. Most of the entries were short and functional. Meeting notes, decision records, names and dates and outcomes. This entry was longer. I wrote about the night in the records office. I wrote about the coalition calls, and about Lena Ford's question about whether it was going to work, and about Peter Lane eating his dinner after resolving a border incident that no one had asked him to resolve. I wrote about the Cirrus 4 volunteers who had packed their gear and staged themselves before anyone asked, because that was what you did when you believed in something. I wrote about Vreth standing in the empty doorway saying, "We should have known that." And then, at the end of the entry, I wrote the thing I had been turning over in my mind since I had walked out of that first session 31 days ago. I wrote, "They looked at us and saw something small and forgettable. They forgot, we have been small and forgettable before. We know exactly what to do with it." I closed the log. I finished my tea. Outside the window, the stars were the same as they had always been. Cold, distant, and completely indifferent to the decisions made in small rooms by beings who believed power was something you held rather than something you built. We had never believed that. The clock had run. The clock had stopped. And the galactic ledger had a new line item in it now. It said, "Humans. Founding partners." Not because they asked for the title. Because they earned it. Quietly.